Welcome to The Audible, presented by Trader Joe's. I'm Stuart Mandel, joined by Bruce Feldman and Ralph Russo. I was not with them right after the UNC-TCU game to discuss that debacle for the Tar Heels, but they seem to be mentioning me a lot when I actually saw the video of it the other day. So just two things I want to say real quick. One, Bruce, Dave Matthews, I've never heard that comparison before. Usually you can't see it in yourself if you guys are, but like I have very painful memories of Dave Matthews Band freshman year, fall of '94, which was like right when he exploded. The guy in the dorm room next to me, for a while there, I was waking up every morning to ants marching. I never got into him. I'm sure you didn't. Ralph, are you a fan?
Marginal, it's all right. He's all right. There's
His
some
voice.
good songs there.
Yikes.
Not your thing.
Then,
yeah.
Okay, so Belichick, look, I mean, you guys were like, oh, Stu's right. I'm not going to declare right or wrong after one game. It was an awful one game, but to me, you judge coaching. I do the coaching grades. I don't judge it until at least 1 year in and probably longer. But what I realized during that game and just seeing like social media dunk on him like crazy is nobody else is going to wait a year to judge him. Like many people seem to make up their mind in the third quarter of that game.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. I'm still envisioning you doing a lot of fist pumps that night, though. I mean, come on. There had to be a couple.
No,
it
was more
pumps.
like yeesh, yikes, ooh, like that.
I think what Ralph said though on the last episode was very smart about it. I think so much, especially because you're dealing with a 73-year-old head coach who's new to college football. But it's like how he's got to get momentum going quick, right? I mean, the schedule still sets up very favorably. I mean, Charlotte, who they play this weekend, got hammered by App State. I mean, they should win this game. If they don't win this game, then I think we would be pretty comfortable in declaring you might be onto something. Right now, it's like you might be. Yeah. So the schedule sets up well. The one thing that will be interesting to see is what kind of adjustments does he make. Like it was bad. But I think we should kind of pivot here since.
Wait. There's something else I wanted to say.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
This is your time to shine, Stu. So we certainly don't. This was it. We're literally laying it out there for you,
Yeah,
and you came across. Oh, I want to be humble. I don't want to dunk the ball.
But there's more for me.
But by the way, let me just say one more thing. So go for it, man. Dunk, Stu.
Well, look. I mean, the idea. I didn't know. I mean, we talked about going in. I have no idea what kind of team they were going to be. Right? I think I said 6-6 total guess, but I think it speaks to the reverence around him that if anybody thought he could come in, he and Michael Lombardi could come in December as the portal window is already open with it's not like they spent the last 3 months studying, guys who might go into the portal. They don't have any relationships with anybody in high school coaches and whatnot, and build a good roster like in the first year. Now, next year,
they have guys in the building. Patrick Sudis is one of the better personnel people in college football. He's been there a long time. He's still there. It's not like they don't have people who had been looking at who might be in the portal. So I don't
possibly, but they definitely, their whole branding of this has been, we're going to be the 33rd NFL team, right? We're going to reunite the Patriots. I'm reticent to use this little anecdote, but like, last year, so Big 12 Media Days 2024, I went on a VSiN show in which Michael Lombardi was the co-host, but he wasn't like in the studio. He was like remote from somewhere. Okay, first of all, he kept calling me Bruce. So that was sign number one.
Sure, which of you should be insulted by that?
Yeah. The questions he was asking, and this wasn't surprising at all at the time, right? Were the kind of questions you would get if you did a college football interview on WFAN, right? Like somebody who clearly doesn't follow college football, right? You know what I mean?
Everybody now. It's Dave Matthews, it's you, it's me.
Why is that a dig on Ralph? It's a dig on
it's
maybe
my hometown station. I'm very protective of WFA.
But you know, Ralph, like they know a lot about the Knicks and the Yankees.
He just called everybody in New York City rubes when it comes to college football.
Totally get it. Totally get it. I go on every once in a while, and I totally get it.
And so, like, I was like, oh, okay, I didn't think much of it. And then 6 months later, he's running the personnel department at a college football program. Like, there's going to be a learning curve. Now, they've got their feet under them now. Like, by the time you get to this December, they should know what they're doing and, have those relationships built up. But there was also always a possibility the first roster was going to be pretty rough.
Okay, so what he can do next is he can start complaining about not having enough money, right? That's the pivot here. If they continue to struggle, he can do what all coaches tend to do now and what everybody in college football tends to do now, which is, well, we didn't have enough money. Our roster, those guys are paying a lot more. I'm sure somewhere, TCU is probably paying a whole lot more to their roster than UNC.
You know what he can't do? He can't fire his defensive coordinator.
I bet you he can.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I bet you that guy.
All right, now let's
would fire his father. Would fire his son. I bet you that guy would.
So there was also, speaking of complaining about money, guys. Interesting little war of words this week, where Oklahoma State's about to go up and play Oregon, and Mike Gundy, who always says exactly what's on his mind, and we're going to talk more about Mike Gundy here in a bit with Justin Williams, but he basically said like, well, Oregon spends $40 million on its roster, and I still don't understand why in this day and age that's a bad thing, but kind of really like playing up. Oregon just spends so much more on their roster than we do. And then Dan Lanning didn't just let that one go and said, well, that's what you're supposed to do, right? If you're saving your money, what did he say exactly, guys, about the 6.5 million?
Well, what Lanning basically said was just to the extent of like, hey, like, I'm fortunate to be at a place that invests the way you need to invest to win. I don't remember the exact quote about the money, but he was just Lanning did a really good job actually of playing it. So like he didn't necessarily come across as using the word dunking on Gundy, but he definitely stressed this idea that like, hey, like we're fortunate here, right? We want to win. And they understand the Oregon understands what it takes to win, and we're down with that. Now, so if anybody else is not down with that, that's your problem. We are down with what it takes to win, Bruce.
Yeah, I think what this is starting to feel like, and maybe it won't go this way, was when Colorado was 3-0 and went in there and got annihilated, and Dan Lanning had receipts, and Oregon was ready to put them out there. And it feels like that's where this is headed. It's one of those things where I don't know about you guys, but I was expecting this to be a blowout as soon as we pivoted. Honestly, Haas Haney is a talented, dual threat quarterback. He's out for a little while, got hurt in the opener, really in the first quarter, and Zane Flores is taken over. This is a tough ask for him. I feel like, if anything, Gundy's comments have only like run up the cash register on what they're going to have to pay here. I would not be surprised if they lose by 40 in this game, or if they go even more than that.
The exact quotes, which I probably should have pulled up before I introduced this topic. Gundy said, Oregon is paying a lot of money for their team. From a non-conference standpoint, there's coaches saying they should, and this is in parentheticals, play teams with similar budgets. To which Lanning said, if you want to be a top 10 team in college football, you better be invested in winning. We spend to win. Some people save to have an excuse for why they don't. I agree, Bruce, exactly. It's very reminiscent of when Dan Lanning they had the camera in the locker room to see like just how he felt about Dion. And then in other, you got to love the week one, like people sniping in the media and stuff. A.J. McCarron, former Alabama quarterback, raised some eyebrows, guys, with some very candid comments. He was down on the sideline during the disaster against Florida State and said that there was no excitement. Like he basically just questioned he kind of put everybody on blast, to be perfectly honest, about And I think the worst thing, if you're a struggling coach or a coach who's starting to feel the heat, is when the former players start dunking on you.
But AJ also did the money thing too, right?
Yes.
We're not spending enough money here at Alabama. There are schools that are spending twice as much, which again, what the hell? If Alabama's roster is that talented and they're spending half as much with the amount of blue chips on that roster, then Alabama should be applauded for its efficiency. I don't want to come across as it's all a coaching problem, but talent should not be a problem for Alabama, Bruce.
Unless, Ralph, they frame it as, you know what, Caleb Downs was the best young defensive player we've had here in a long, long time. We thought we were going to lose him to Georgia and go back to his home state, and then we ended up losing him to somebody else, Ohio State, and they won the national title with him. And he's now the best defensive player in the country. And back in the old days when he played, AJ McCarron played, Alabama was not going to get outspent, whether it was, I don't know, I'm not expecting him to say this, whether it was under the table or not. They were going to make sure that they got whoever they needed to get. I don't know how that's exactly lands when you have a roster loaded with 4- and 5-star guys. I mean, they just, Keelan Russell, one of the most coveted quarterbacks in the country last year. Alabama ended up getting him. You look all over the roster, they have a bunch of those guys. And so I don't know. I think one of those, it's interesting comments. I think to back to what Stu said, AJ McCarron made a lot of comments last year on podcasts. I think he was pretty critical of Jalen Milroe. And I think, you definitely have some prominent former players at all sorts of schools who I think internally, when those former players, when those coaches' families see somebody speaking out when the team is struggling or reeling, they get very defensive and be like, why are we getting this from the people who are our own? It's one thing for the Paul Feinbaums of the world, for the Dan Orlovskis of the world, for, whoever on social media to start zinging us. It's another thing when it's somebody who, is one of us. They feel like that lands differently.
I will say about the NIL situation there is some merit to it. I mean, for several years, Greg Byrne was imploring people to donate to their collective because that just wasn't their fan base's mindset. Like, we're Alabama, we're always going to be good. The schools, the programs, if you've noticed over the years, that have kind of made a huge splash in this space are the next level down. Tennessee, Ole Miss, certainly Texas Tech, like the schools that need to pay a lot of money to even be in the same ballpark as to compete in recruiting and transfer portal. I think places like Alabama and Georgia just kind of took it for granted, like those players will always come here. Now, I don't know if that's still the case. That was kind of early days NIL. The reason I think McCarron's comment about that got a little overplayed is he said, we're spending less than $20 million. Okay, well, how much less? Because Brian Kelly made a big deal about, in a positive way, about how they're spending $18 million on this roster. I don't think,
And he said they tripled their budget from last year, by the way.
Yeah, and it's possible
it's not
Alabama
like that wasn't a
too.
Talented team, too, right? That was a very talented
Alabama's
roster,
has
too.
been lagging. So I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out this year becomes apparent that they just don't have the players they used to. I would have a little sympathy for money being a factor in that. Not so much for the high school kids, but most of this collective money goes toward retaining players and portal kids, right? So you can have all the 4 and 5 stars like you've always had. That doesn't necessarily mean that's where it's showing up. But to Ralph's point, we know there's talent on that roster. I mean,
Ralph, can I ask you a question on this? So having all that we just talked about, when you watch the game, and you weren't on with us on Sunday morning, but when you watch the game, and we talked a little bit about this, when we evaluated what your top 25 was going to be this week. To me, it doesn't feel like a real talent issue. What got them the other day in Tallahassee, it looked like a want to and a physicality thing. I don't know how you point to that and say, would Caleb Downs have helped that? Sure, he would have. But I just felt like it was guys who didn't look like they wanted it as much as Florida State did. I don't think that's a money thing.
So I'm a little hesitant all the time to sort of question effort, want to, because that could look like that when you're not good enough or not coached well enough, or you're just caught by surprise. But so those two things sometimes can be hard to decipher, right? Is this team not necessarily prepared well enough, or is the effort not there? But I can, a lot of people have been making a lot of headway on social media right now, this over the last couple of days, pointing out Alabama's lack of effort, right? So, far be it for me to question what the tape looks like. I think I know Florida State is not loaded with a bunch of NFL guys, and I trust, Dane Brugler from The Athletic, Alabama seems to have a lot of NFL guys on their front lines. So if they're getting pushed around, and if Florida State is just, as you said, there is a little bit, I always frame effort this way, Bruce. It's not how much effort you play with, it's how much effort are you matching the effort of your opponent? And that might be the place where Alabama was lacking, because that was never lacking at Alabama. Alabama always set the tone when it came to effort under Saban. You had to match their effort. You had to match their intensity. And it seemed like what was going on Saturday is Florida State was setting the tone, setting the standard for how hard we're going to play today. And Alabama, whether they're loafing or things along those lines, I don't know, but they weren't matching that intensity. So that's the way I would frame it. And that is a product of coaching, frankly. So again, it kind of goes back to talent instead of coaching.
Yeah, and I would just say, all those years under Saban, to me, one of the most telling things about the process and how effective they were in getting everybody to buy in the whole building was those season openers, right? They would play almost every year a neutral site opener against Michigan or Virginia Tech or I'm trying to remember who else it was. USC, right? And they would kick Florida State when Florida State was ranked very highly and kick their butt. Like every single time, Alabama was clearly the better prepared team. They also were probably the more talented team, but like they were clicking like it was week 7 in week 1, and Alabama just looked completely overmatched, overwhelmed, whatever you want to say. It wasn't like one area, they were really bad in this one area. They were really bad in every area. So,
all right, to bring it back to Gundy, because we are going to get back to a bigger discussion about Mike Gundy with our colleague Justin Williams. He better be careful what he wishes for. You talked about this idea of like, maybe we should play teams that only spend similarly to us. Buddy, that's how come Oklahoma and Texas left your conference, because they didn't want to play you anymore because they felt like you were making money off of them. And frankly, Oregon doesn't want to play you anymore either. That's bad. That's bad for the Big 12, and it's bad for Oklahoma State. And I would also say it might be bad for college football. Oregon wants to play Oklahoma. The Big 10 wants to play the SEC. The more those schools come together and those conferences come together and hoard all the big games and hoard all the money and tell you guys, you're less than. He basically just validated Tony Petiti's argument. We shouldn't be playing these guys. They spend too much money.
He inadvertently created a super league.
Dude, that's why they don't want to give you more playoff spots. Like just be careful. I'm not saying it's fair either. Like I understand if I'm Gundy, I get feeling like I'm bringing a knife to a gunfight when I enter Eugene, but like it's what he is talking about is sort of happening, and it's not great for college football, and it is not great for Oklahoma State. And we'll talk a lot more about Oklahoma State and Mike Gundy with Justin Williams after the break. He did a great story, or has a great story coming up, very well reported, on what the hell went down in Stillwater last December. Welcome back to The Audible. We're joined now by our great colleague at The Athletic, Justin Williams. Justin, good to see you. Glad you could join the show. bringing you on because you've been working on a pretty big story about the coach that we were just talking about, and that's Mike Gundy of Oklahoma State. Mike made some news this week talking about budgets and things along those lines. But in some ways, it's almost I don't know, an upset, but maybe a hair of a surprise that he's even still the coach at Oklahoma State this year. When you dug in on Gundy and his interesting offseason, what'd you find?
Yeah, so there will be a lot new about Oklahoma State football this Saturday at Oregon. I think they have 65 new players, 12 new assistants, basically just kind of stripped it down and overhauled that whole program. But people might remember in December, after the end of the regular season last year, there was like a board, specially called board meeting at Oklahoma State, and basically ended with kind of a brief standoff between Gundy and the university that then ended with him signing a restructured contract. He took like $1 million pay cut for this year. There's some other things in there. They redid the buyout terms a little bit. He had been on this perpetual 5-year contract, essentially a lifetime contract, that now that's kind of a more traditional, I think, 4-year contract. So it kind of got lost because I think it was conference championship week and Oklahoma State had just been terrible last year. But this is a guy who they were coming off 18 straight bowl appearances. Obviously, like, he's been there 20 years. He's the winningest coach in program history. Had his worst season as a head coach last year. And for a moment there, it looked like it might end up being his last season before they were able to kind of restructure that contract and come back together. But going into a big game this weekend, there's going to be some attention because of the headlines. I do think it's fair to say that there's still a little bit of a shaky ground, I think, with Mike Gundy and Oklahoma State moving forward, depending on how this season goes.
Just as a tease, guys, I was in the room when Justin did a lot of the interview with Mike Gundy back this summer at or one of his interviews at Big 12 Media Days. And it was kind of fascinating to hear him. Gundy's an interesting person because he feels like he comes from a completely different time of college football. And because I think he's as much representative of his alma mater and his program, the one he coaches at, as anybody I can think of, right? Like, he, to me, is Oklahoma State football. He's won a ton of games, and last year was as bad as it probably gets, and the way it culminated the way it did, with that sort of standoff before it, you didn't know which way it was going to go that night, especially. I want to ask you this, Justin, though, like, from the people you've talked to, it feels like, to me now, Mike Gundy needs Oklahoma State a lot more than maybe it needs him. Do you think that's accurate, or what's your sense on that?
It's funny. So earlier in his career, I think he kind of flirted with the Tennessee job at one point and with Arkansas at one point. And he actually, talked about, when I talked to him this summer, that, it was nice to be wanted at those points in his career, and, maybe even got a little infatuated with that attention.
He definitely got more money in some of those times when his name would get brought into those conversations too, by the way. Right.
And I don't know that that's happening at this point anymore, but I also don't know that that's what Mike Gundy wants or cares about. He talked about how important being the head coach at Oklahoma State is, and what he means to that program, what that program means to him. And he's spent so much of his life there. So I think what he cares about now is he wants to finish out his career at Oklahoma State, however much longer that goes. He wants to kind of leave this really rich legacy there. But you're right that, on the flip side of that, I don't know that those other jobs are necessarily coming calling for him. Maybe that changes if he goes on another run and has a good couple years, but it almost feels like he's kind of settled into, this is where he wants to be at Oklahoma State for as long as he can. And, I think this past offseason was a good example of maybe the university wondering, like, do they want to continue working with Mike Gundy? I talked to Chad Weiberg, who's the athletic director there. He's still a big advocate for Gundy, still believes he's kind of the right person for that job. Weiberg's another person with really deep ties to Oklahoma State, went there, has worked there for a long time. I think both of those guys understand the dynamic of that university and being the coach there. But, it does seem like we're at one point, maybe it was going to be, this relationship ends when Gundy leaves and goes somewhere else. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think Gundy wants to be there, and now it's, can he win enough and be successful enough to stay there, or does the university have to make that decision at some point?
First, the way you put that about who needs whom more, I think Oklahoma State needs Gundy. And it's interesting, Justin, like, for a guy who has seemingly, I know you put it as like 9 lives, right? Like, I mean, he's had so many moments there where, as successful as he's been, they soured on him. You know, there was the thing in 2020, very controversial. Nobody has ever won at Oklahoma State at nearly the level he has. And so let's say they have another bad year this year and he gets fired. I feel like that's the kind of place where like 10 years from now, they'll be like, oh, what have we done? Like, is there any reason to believe Oklahoma State can be a 9-10 win kind of program without him?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I certainly think there's a possibility that could happen, but something that came up, I talked to a few boosters and people around the program. You know, in the history of Oklahoma State, coaches like Les Miles and Jimmy Johnson have gone there and had success, and then they've kind of used it as a stepping stone to go on to bigger jobs. And even though we talked about Gundy maybe flirting with some of those bigger jobs, he never did that. He stayed there. And so I do think there's an understanding, you know, even maybe people who might be ready to move on from Gundy, this idea that if you bring in a new coach and you make a good hire and there's maybe some excitement from that new hire with season ticket holders or, you know, just fans in general, if that coach has a good 2 or 3 seasons, there's a good chance in this landscape that that coach is probably moving on and going somewhere else.
Yeah.
And, you know, Gundy has shown that, you know, through his history, which he's had a lot of success, he has not moved on. And so there's definitely a little bit of if we bring in somebody new, maybe they struggle because could be a tough place to win in Stillwater. Or maybe it's we bring in someone new and they do great, and then in 2 or 3 years they're having to make another hire again. So I think that's the dynamic that Oklahoma State, you know, has to deal with. They would obviously prefer if Gundy would just go back to having some success, but if at some point they do have to kind of weigh that, I think that'll be something that's front of mind.
Even though that the two, you know, superpowers that are, you know, kind of different than the rest of the Big 12, Texas and OU are now in the SEC and not in the Big 12. The part I wonder about is, and Justin, I know you touched on this in your story about talking to a lot of people who see Gundy as a player's coach from their own experiences playing for him. But I wonder, the Mike Gundy that had so much success, the climate around college football has changed a lot, not just NIL, transfer portal. There's a lot of things that are now different than they were just 5 years ago. And I'm not saying like I know he had success a couple of years ago, but I think it is much harder to sustain that when you have guys who were with you for a core group for a long time and come up through the development process. As Justin said, you know, he's really turned over the staff significantly on top of that. I think that's the hard part that's different. I get what you're saying, Stu, about like, oh, they may regret this 10 years from now if they run him out after a disappointing year following last season. But I just don't know if again, I could be wrong. Like he may go out and knock off Oregon and go on and win 8 or 9 games this year or more. But I just wonder if it's like, it's very different now to be a college head coach than it was just a few years ago for Mike Gundy. I mean, I don't know, Ralph, like just to bring you back in on this, like, do you kind of see where I'm going, or you think that's like, no, he's earned the benefit of the doubt?
No, the guy who comes to mind is Gary Patterson, right? And how that ended at TCU, not pretty, not well. And I do wonder if we're just heading toward that, which brings me, because GP was one of these guys too, kind of defiant, refused to ever say like, I'm not the problem, right? Justin, and you're talking with Gundy, that's a guy who doesn't very rarely, you know, seems to want to say, hey, no, I'll change my ways. Is he still defiant?
You know, it's funny, actually, a couple of years ago, I think the year they went, I guess 23, when they would have gone to the Big 12 championship, like they started that year slow and kind of came on strong and had a better year than anybody expected. And, you know, I remember talking to him and he talked about how he was kind of slow to adapt to the transfer portal and NIL. And I do think he's come around on that a little bit, probably, you know, later than some coaches or later than Oklahoma State fans would hope. So I do think he has made that transition, but kind of what Bruce alluded to, I think a lot of Gundy's success over the years was, it's not like Oklahoma State was bringing in 4 and 5 stars. Even when T. Boone Pickens was given a bunch of money, Gundy was finding those players and developing them. And, then he'd have a team with a lot of juniors and seniors who were really experienced, established players, and they would go out and kind of perform above their recruiting rankings, or, play well against schools like Oklahoma and Texas that might have had better star players and things like that. And that's a lot tougher to do, like Bruce said, in kind of this climate of college football. It's not as easy to bring in guys and hold on to them for 3 or 4 years. And then the flip side of that too, which goes back to the Texas and Oklahoma thing, is the Big 12's wide open now, right? And so I think every team feels kind of this pressure with revenue sharing, with NIL, with all of this, to have success now because there's a window. Arizona State showed that last year with what they were able to do. And so I think there's even less reason for schools to be patient if they feel like maybe this isn't, the right situation or the right staff or the right coach to have that success and compete for a playoff. And so I think, again, that's all stuff that Oklahoma State is going to have to reckon with. Gundy can kind of quiet it by coming out and having another Gundy bounce back season, which is totally possible. But if you get to the end of the year and maybe they're fighting for a bowl game, or they don't feel like a lot of progress has been made on 24, I think it'll be interesting to see how they handle that, for a second straight offseason.
But let me follow up with this, though, because I'm also sort of asking about Mike Gundy, the person. He almost got fired. Was he humbled at all by that experience?
I think we asked him, at media days, were you surprised to kind of, have a chance to be in that situation where the job could be taken away from you after so much success? And, I think he said, it would be unfair for him to say he wasn't a little bit surprised. But again, I think he's at this point in his career where he really values Oklahoma State and wants to be there. And so, look, he took some concessions in terms of redoing that contract and coming back this year. He took a pay cut. He kind of gave away a little bit of power, some of the leverage he had. And so, if you injected him with truth serum, what would he say about that? I don't know. But I think, at least in some ways, by signing that contract and making some concessions, he showed I didn't have a good year last year, but this job is important to me. So I'm going to do what I can to come back and move forward.
So Justin, you cover the Big 12 as close as anybody. You know that conference. And I'm just curious, moving beyond Oklahoma State here for a little bit, early impressions. Obviously, it wasn't the greatest opening weekend for the Big 12. Utah being a notable exception. Any changes so far from kind of what you expected it to look like going into the season through what we've seen so far?
The other exception would be TCU, right? Shoving North Carolina in the wood chipper. But you're right, because before that, I think Cincinnati, Baylor, and Colorado, all kind of had these big primetime marquee matchups against other Power 4 schools and fell short. And those are the games that the Big 12 needs to win to get that respect, when it comes to playoff conversations and things like that. But just kind of stepping back, Iowa State obviously impressed. I know, Bruce has been riding Iowa State this offseason as a contender, and they certainly looked like it. Kansas State would be the flip side, where they almost lost to North Dakota, and maybe aren't the contender we thought. But I guess coming out of the first week, or for some of these teams, they played 2 games. Iowa State, Arizona State, and Utah kind of are the 3 that maybe stand out. With maybe Kansas, they haven't played a lot of good competition in those first 2 games, but Kansas has looked good. But those 3 that I mentioned, I think, were the ones that now feel like they're kind of the top contenders for me.
Well, the good news is they're also going all in on Barstool, apparently, and Dave Portnoy and that relationship, which we found out a little bit today. So that'll fix everything. Yeah, right. They may not have playoff teams, but they're embracing Dave Portnoy.
Attention is everything in college football these days, and Portnoy and Barstool seem to be good at getting attention. So the Big 12 might be kind of riding along with that now too.
So Justin's story is going to publish in the next day or so, depending on when you're watching this podcast or listening to this podcast. I think it's Friday. Of this week. Justin's story is supposed to publish on Mike Gundy. Justin Williams, thanks so much for joining us today here on the Audible. After this, come back and do a little mailbag.
All right, we appreciate Justin Williams for joining us. He actually made me chuckle inside a little bit with his wood chipper reference. It made me think that Justin probably don't want to get too drunk at the next offsite because you don't know where his mind is going.
Bruce, have you ever seen the movie Fargo?
I have, but I haven't thought it introduced into like introduced into a college football discussion
when it comes to wood chippers.
It was an impressive pull by him. So, all right, let's pivot to the mailbag. As always, send your questions to the audiblepod@gmail.com. This question is from Brian in Seattle, and it's a reference to something Stu and I talked about the other day. Hi, folks. I hate the transfer portal. In a recent discussion, you weren't willing to say that you hate the transfer portal in this regard, the immediate eligibility non-graduate version of the transfer portal. But I'll say it, I think a lot of people would agree with my reasoning. If I have to learn all the new players each year, it doesn't feel like I'm rooting for the same team. I'm a Huskies fan, and we had 2 returning starters in 2024 as compared to 2023. I'm sure many of the transfers are good and nice people, but the sport doesn't feel the same. Do you think it's possible that Stu and you, Bruce, your opinion is shaped by the fact that you really aren't fans of individual teams like most of us and more just fans of the sport? Keep up the hard work and explain yourself, Stu.
I fully admit that as a kind of neutral observer, like I don't feel the pain of the transfer portal like a fan of an individual team does, right? The closest I've come to that, honestly, is through the prism of my daughter, who has become a big Stanford softball fan because we live close to there. And who is her favorite player? Nigel Kennedy, the phenom pitcher. And so, Matt, remember, she would have been 8 at this time. Me having to explain, Nigel Kennedy's going to Texas Tech. She's not going to be on Stanford next year. Why? Somebody gave her $1 million. So I get it. I do. From a broader standpoint, I think it's been great for the sport because we've talked about this. It gives people hope. It gave Florida State fans hope that they're not going to go 2-10 every year. It gave Indiana fans hope last year that they could have this remarkable turnaround. But it's easier, that's a very rose-colored way of looking at it, I would admit, right? It's not so fun. And the people I have particular sympathy for are Group of 5 fans. Or even like lower level. I mean, I feel like Georgia Tech has become a feeder program for Alabama and, whatnot. Like, that's no fun. You get to know your player. He's, we've got this great player. Oh, he's gone. But in some ways, guys, and I'd ask you this, Ralph, like, isn't that what's always been happening with coaches? If you're a Group of 5 fan, you're kind of used to it at this point. Like, if our coach, if I'm an Ohio Bobcats fan, Tim Albin's going to leave us next year. And now that's just kind of starting to happen to the players too.
Yeah, and that is exactly why we got here, right? It's hard to limit the players' movement when the coaches can do whatever they want. And that's always been the argument. I do think, Stu, that we have reached, as much as I have been an advocate for players having a lot more freedom and getting paid, I also would say that we have probably reached the too much ice cream phase with the transfer portal. Like, we all love ice cream, but at a certain point, it's probably not good for you. I don't think this much movement is even good for the players. I think bouncing to 2, 3, 4 schools within 3 or 4 years is probably not good for the players. Maybe they're making a little extra money, but I don't know if they're necessarily being taken care of in the best ways. And I don't know if they're, all the promises that they're hearing with those checks are being delivered on. It's probably not great for their development, not even to mention their education. So hopefully in the next couple of years, as we build guardrails or whatever you want to call it to this new system, they can rein in some of the transfer portal stuff, not to the point of the old days where you have to sit out all the time and schools can dictate where you go, where you transfer. Those days are over. But it would be better if there was a little more tamped down and control over just how much movement. So, right, fans can sort of feel like we have this guy for at least 2 years. I can support him before he goes on to bigger and better things.
I always remind people, as much as the NCAA is always the bad guy in these things, they had what I thought was a very reasonable rule that got put in place a few years ago. You can transfer once and play right away. You can't transfer every year and play right away. I thought that was a good system. And of course, like everything NCAA these days, somebody sued. Let's see, in that one, it was the Attorney
State
General
of
West Virginia, and a judge gave them an injunction, and now it's unlimited transfers. And it's frankly amazing that something that significant, right, Ralph, like that happened very quickly. There was like a lawsuit, and I don't know, 2 weeks later, everybody could transfer as much as they want. And now that's, said that, and then that became a permanent rule. But, you and I did that story, gosh, sometime earlier this year about we saw some of the early rev share contracts. And one of the ways the schools are trying to slow this down is by putting in buyouts, like in coaches' contracts. You can transfer. We can't stop you from transferring, but if you do, like you owe us 50% of what we paid you, or in some cases it was even more punitive than that. So we'll see if that has some kind of organic effect on slowing things down.
Hey, last thing to add to that, though, Stu. Can I jump in? The last thing to add to that, because it was related to that story, it was the idea that when we talked to schools, there was also a fair amount of them that said, well, we don't know if we really want 2-year contracts because then we're stuck with that guy and we can't go out and replace him with a transfer. So when we talk about the transfer thing and all the activity, it is a two-way street. Don't just blame the players here.
As somebody who, probably the only one on this podcast who transferred in college numerous times, I think I probably went to 4 or 5 schools. I lose track, but it's a real thing. I do think there's something for your flexibility of where you fit and what's right for you. And I think that, I get why fans are frustrated, but at the end of the day, it's also, people's livelihoods. And a lot of those things change, and whatever circumstance may be good here may not be good at the right time. And then you'd often get these, when it got contested, it would be like, oh, it's a mental health issue because they knew that was a probably thing that would win in a court case or different things like that. It's gotten really messy. But I think part of that is because the world has looked at college athletes more, I don't want to say humanely, that's not the right way to say it, but I just think it's in a much different prism than in the days when Bobby Knight was the coach or Woody Hayes was the coach, or schools were stockpiling players because they didn't want somebody else to have them because they didn't want to play against them. I mean, I think we're a long way away from those days. Yeah,
I mean, that was a good point about the mental health. I mean, the reason, Ralph, correct me if I'm wrong, and then we will pivot, that lawsuit ended up where it was that, like, if the NCAA just said you can transfer once and that's it, like hard and fast rule. If you try to transfer a second time, you got to sit out a year. But they still had those waivers, and it was very arbitrary who got a waiver and who didn't. And Mac Brown raised a fit, right, when that receiver
Tez Walker
didn't get cleared. So what happens then? Somebody sues. Bruce, real quick, can you just give us the full list of the school? I feel like you change the number every time.
I started out at Marist College in New York. I transferred to a junior college that was there for a year, transferred to Albany State, which is now UAlbany, Jared versus his old school. I did some courses at another SUNY school, which, as Ralph knows, is State University of New York. And then I transferred down to the University of Miami. So that's the list.
Wow. Yeah,
you were a circuitous path.
Yeah,
and it was 6 years, and there were no advanced degrees in there.
you were like Chandler Morris of before there was. I was trying to think of a random guy that's been at like a million.
John English
places.
Would be the one. He's before your time, Stu, but he's like the ultimate of the 80s. His dad was a coach. He bounced around more before anybody else was doing it. And he was a good quarterback at Tulane. Eventually.
But did he? Well, if that was the case, though, didn't he lose a year every time he did that?
You'd have to go back and look. His story was really fascinating. I tried to get one of our colleagues who this came up, and I was like, you ought to talk to John English. I think this would make for a good story, and somebody will probably go do it now.
Ralph, this next question from Adam Boland in Pittsburgh is definitely geared to you. I enjoy the discussions on the pod around the AP poll and Ralph's process for filling out his ballot each week. As a result, I've started to pay more attention to the poll this season. As a Notre Dame fan, I noticed that the post-Week 1 poll had 3 voters who left the Irish unranked, while the remaining 62 had them slotted no or lower than 15th. Ralph, in your years running the poll, how often would you become aware that a voter accidentally left a team off their ballot?
It happens. I can't speak for what happened this week, right? I'm completely out of that world now. So I don't know if that was sometimes very early in the season voters make drastic moves on polls. Like, I mean, I did to a certain degree by putting Florida State 10th after having them unranked. And maybe a couple of voters thought, you know what? If you lost, you're out. Maybe they were low on Notre Dame before and they decided so after they lost, they were out. But occasionally, yes, there will be just simple mistakes made. You're shuffling teams around. Somebody gets left off a ballot. There are some quality control things in place to sort of catch that. So you catch it before the poll publishes. Again, I don't know what the situation is here, but it wasn't completely uncommon to have the poll publish and then go, oh no. Some voter would call in and be like, hey man, I left X off my ballot. So then you end up having a little bit of a discussion of like, okay, how long has it been out there? Should we go back in and update it? How much harassment are you getting online for leaving this team off? Because that gets taken into account too. The AP doesn't want to leave their voters hanging. So it does happen. There are some measures in place to try to avoid it from happening. I know he had talked about some other process issues. Yes, you're voting online. There's a drop down. You pick teams out of a drop down. Once a team is used within the drop down, you can't go back and put them in twice. So that's a good fail safe, right? That's a good security measure, so to speak. So you don't end up with mistakes. But teams getting left out, again, it definitely happens, especially during the normal part of the season, where people are voting late Saturday night into Sunday morning. They've already had a long day of covering games and they're a little bleary-eyed. People make mistakes on their ballot. It does happen. And you do the best you can to fix it before it actually gets published and to catch it. But, occasionally it does happen.
Okay, Ralph, I have a question I never thought to ask you till this very moment. In all your years of administering and overseeing the AP Top 25 poll, how often or has it happened where you've come across a voter and you kind of look and you go, this person seems to really have it out for school X. I don't know if I want this person in the poll going forward.
Okay, I will be very honest with you here. I never had that. I never had this person has it out for somebody. And there have been some voters who got so much heat from fan bases because a fan base just didn't like the way they were voting that I even had a couple of conversations with voters of like, hey, like the perception, if you go back and forth with these fans, is that you're going to have a bias. They think you have a bias. And if you keep going back and forth with them, they are going to believe that more so. So I will say, this is being completely honest, I never had a voter that I thought was blatantly biased, because quite frankly, that would have got you booted, and had it sort of out. But again, you get those situations where, man, these people are coming after me so much, like I got to defend myself. What we did have in terms of like, I don't want them back on the poll is, if you're late constantly, if you are forgetting teams constantly, if your process is bad and it's making it hard for me on the other side to get the poll out on time, to write about it, then we need to have a talk at the end of the season with our internally about, hey, do we want to ask that person back? I think process becomes more likely to get you booted than bias.
So reading between the lines, I'm taking this to say, if you're a person who really struggles with technology and kind of mucks up the process and it becomes very arduous, you're pretty ready to cut bait.
It could be. Are you implying that Stu would have had problems voting? Is this what we're coming through
Well,
here?
when I was a voter so long ago, 2006 to 2008, we just emailed it. There was no
emailing or calling them in.
The great move in post right now would be for Matt to slide Stu all the way out of the picture and just bump it out just to see how it looks.
And yes, Stu, yes, I worked for the AP at a time when, remember, because I started at the AP out of college back in the 90s. So voters would call in after midnight. A big part of my shift between 12 between midnight and 3 in the morning before I went home would be taking calls from voters and input. It was still done by the computer, the tabulating, but you would take a call from a voter and manually insert it into a computer, manually feed it into a computer where it would be tabulated, or faxed. We had a lot of faxed votes at that time.
Gosh, really? Where were they? You just covered a game. You go back to your hotel conference center and fax your ballot.
I don't want to drag us down here, but at some point you have to. We'll talk about how I became friends with Jim Nance through the voter process.
Wow.
Yes.
Real quick, I played a minor role in changing, probably a very minor role in changing a policy of the AP poll when Appalachian State beat Michigan. Terry Taylor, the sports editor, was running it.
Yes.
I don't think I was alone. I think many of us did this by email and said, "Can I vote for an FCS team?" And she initially said no. And then I guess enough of us sent the same email that they changed it. Like, yes, you can vote for an FCS team.
And
I think Appalachian State was ranked for a week. If I'm not mistaken.
I think they received votes. I don't know if they actually got ranked, but yeah. So anyway, I got a whole bunch of poll stuff. We can go on forever.
I think you should write a book about your years overseeing the AP poll.
That interesting,
or at least an article for Bruce's Arch Manning story was his most read story ever at The Athletic. If your story was like tales from all the terrible voters I've dealt with at the AP poll.
See, I can't do that. I'm not here to out people here, Stu. All right, let's get to the next mailbag question here. All right, hey guys, before NIL, Maryland had gone to and won 3 straight bowl games. Not amazing from a national sense, but great for them. Since they've been terrible. How do teams like this succeed nowadays? And that's Daniel Tubin. We're going to go with Tubin from Fairfax, Virginia.
Frequent emailer Daniel Tubin. I actually did a story on Maryland a couple years ago with Jana Bardall, and Mike Loxley was pretty candid, they are, to me, one of the definitive, they're screwed in the NIL era. They do not have those kind of donors. And at that time, they had just opened a sparkling new football facility, right, that had been in the works for so many years. And great Mike Loxley quote, he's like, we did all that, and now these kids would get dressed in a trash can for $25,000. What good did that do? But he also said, Mike Loxley is known as a great recruiter, right? A great, especially in that DC area. And he's like, my whole thing is I built relationships with the families, and it almost doesn't matter now. It's just about how much we can pay them. So now will rev share, that's the great question, right? Now Maryland can pay $20.5 million, whatever they're going to pay for football. Does that help close that gap a little bit? But in the collective era, they didn't have a chance.
I think it's going to be interesting to see. They have a really talented young quarterback. I remember seeing him at the Elite 11 a year ago. Malik Washington looked really good early this season. It's like when you get a really good player, and again, Maryland is a Big Ten school. And as you said, Stu, Loxley has a lot of juice in the DMV area to get high level talent, which they've had. I think the tricky part for Maryland, because they've had some, and this goes back, to the Phrygian days and even before that, where they've had some top level talent in spots, whether it's Stephon Diggs or you go back to Vernon Davis, you can go all in different places. It's like they could have had a really good 7-on-7 team a few years ago, right? They had really good receivers, some good running backs and really good DBs. And the line really struggled or whatever. I think it's the having everything at once. And they were also in the loaded side of the Big Ten and the Big Ten East, which didn't make it any easier. I feel like at that school, it's like if you win 8 games, and I think he had 3 years in a row of eight wins, which they didn't have for a long time before that. I think the challenge is, not just can you sustain it, but can you develop guys and hang on to them where they do not bail out because they want to go, I don't know if it's all right, now Alabama's going to come for some of his players. That's where he came from. But one of those kinds of deals. And I think that's a challenge where you're in that mid-level. To PJ Fleck's credit, Minnesota has been able to sustain success and develop Like I think they've done some really smart recruiting. There's a handful of guys who've been like really coveted, but for the most part, their starting quarterback is from Fayetteville. Arkansas wasn't offering him. Last year they saw him. The kid's as big as a door. And Drake Lindsay was learned behind Brosmer, and they were like, all right, we don't need to go in the portal. We got this guy. And I would imagine, again, I'm not saying that's the model for everybody, but it is working pretty well with the Gophers. I don't know how much better they can take it. Can they be a playoff team with that? We just saw Indiana become a playoff team, so why not? But I think that's to me the middle ground that they're in. And I don't know, there's a handful of schools are in that as long as they're in the power conference schools. But like, Ralph, do you think that is like sustainable for most schools to think, okay, it's kind of like how BC used to be, where they'd be like, you're a developmental program, you have a lot of teams that are competitive, and then that one year when kids are seniors, you can be a top 10 caliber team. Like, you remember those BC days, it's before Adazio was the head coach. But do you think that's somewhere where like these teams could kind of use that as a model still?
So yes, I think real quick, I do think a lot of those teams that, again, sort of like the developmental cycle teams, like we're into a cycle and we hit the right cycle and bam, we knock out a good year. I think it's still possible if something that looks like a cap, if there's some balance here. I don't think it's ever going to be a hard cap, but if something is in place to regulate and give a little bit of level playing field to the money. And as we talked about with the first question, if there is some control about movement of players that encourages them to stay, or at least limits them a little bit on how much they can move around. If that's the case, yeah, I think Maryland can be what Maryland has been. But there might be a few things within the system that need to happen to allow that to happen.
All right, so let's do this, guys. We have a $12 Trader Joe's gift card to give out. Each of you say who you think should get it. And if you split, I will cast the deciding vote.
You go first, Bruce.
I like the poll question just because it got us thinking about like the inner workings of Ralph professionally. So I'm going to go with that one.
I'm going to go with number one in the transfer portal question because I don't like talking about myself, which is, by the way, a lie. I love talking about myself, but I'm trying.
Well, you come to the right place. It's a podcast.
Right.
All right. I think they're both good questions, but I am going to go with Adam Bolin from Pittsburgh about the AP because that really opened up some great storytelling there from Ralph. So, Adam, please send your mailing address to theaudiblepod@gmail.com. Everybody else, to send your questions to theaudiblepod@gmail.com. And a reminder, you can now watch our Sunday morning show live on YouTube. Join us for the live stream at 11:30 Eastern, 8:30 Pacific on @Audible Show on YouTube. We'll see you next time.